Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, thank you to BSides Delaware for having me and first speaker of the day. So thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this. As I mentioned, literally anytime I can talk about this, I'm excited. So today I'm going to be presenting on human perception, the missing security control. I am a security architect by day, an adjunct professor by night, as well as several other things. I also co-host the Resilient Cyber podcast. So, just a couple little things I like to do. All right, so what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to cover quite a few topics since I have the time. We're going to start with talking about security controls. I'm sure you guys are all aware of what they are, but I'm going to talk about sort of give us a baseline here of what I'm sort of adding context to. And then I want to talk about some of the different IT and security roles specifically related to security controls. What is perception? And I'm going to talk a little bit about perception and cognition. Senses and cybersecurity. How does perception change over time? i.e., how does our risk change over time? And then I wanted to provide some case examples, some ways that this may manifest itself within different organizations or within different teams. And then hopefully some final takeaways, some really practical stuff that you guys can use and take back to your organizations, your teams, things to think about and digest and see where it goes. Okay, as I mentioned, security architect by day, primarily, so at IBM, I'm part of the CISO's security innovation and remediation team. So I do a lot of remediation activities as well as on the innovation side, trying to solve those big complex problems, within a large organization. I'm also an adjunct professor at Capital Technology University. That is the school that I received my DSc in cybersecurity in. And I'm currently wrapping up a PhD in human factors. So shock, that's why I'm sort of talking about this topic today. The last year and a half of research has really changed the way I feel about cybersecurity. So I have a background in IT ops. So I was an administrator. I did managed virtual environments. I did AD, SCCM, Citrix, VMware, you name it. And then transitioned into security about probably about 4 years ago now. I got really interested in vulnerability chaining, vulnerability scoring. How are vulnerabilities scored? How do we understand what vulnerabilities are? And so when I was studying that for the DSC, I saw this PhD in human factors, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I want to see how if I can understand psychology better, if I can understand humans better, can I improve cybersecurity, our security posture, and reduce our risk in an environment? And that's really what ultimately led me here. So quick disclaimer, all thoughts, feelings, views expressed in the presentation are my own. They do not reflect any of my employers. And another quick disclaimer, I'm not a licensed therapist or psychologist. I love research. I have a lot of friends that are cognitive psychologists that I've spoken to about research. And there's a sort of a small group of us out there that are sort of really studying sort of the implications of cognitive psychology and understanding how it really affects the security posture of a network. All right, so hopping right in. So security controls. So anyone that's, been in security for any length of time, and even from the IT side, this is really where I was introduced to security controls, was actually as an administrator. So these are anything like applying a group policy, fixing a registry key on an OS baseline template, all kinds of different settings, password length and strength or complexity requirements. How do I handle users versus service accounts? How do I manage my OUs? All of that kind of stuff. Now I'm getting really far into AD. But there are a number of different types of security controls. They're not just, GPOs or settings on a network device. We're actually talking about procedural technical compliance There's also physical security controls. So security controls are really it's really this broad sort of a field. And when I was looking at what security controls do we manage, do we implement, do we look at, I just started to see this like missing sort of piece, right? It's like, okay, so let's say I'm able to implement these security controls, and I'm monitoring them and I'm doing all these other things. But what am I missing? Because we all know like cybersecurity attacks are continuing and they're just increasing in complexity and the way that we sort of handle security, right? Like we're still having all these cyber attacks happening. Phishing attacks are still outrageous and happening all the time. So what are we missing? If I'm applying these security controls properly, how am I still missing, something that's allowing a phishing attack to take place? Anyway, this is where this sort of started, this idea of like, what are we missing that we can't sort of properly put these security controls in place to really mitigate risk? So that sort of got me thinking, well, when I was on the IT side of the house, I didn't really see and perceive security controls the same way that I do now that I'm a security practitioner. From the IT operations side, I'm really implementing those controls. I may have some leverage over what controls are selected, but not always. On the IT side, I may have been told, hey, implement these security controls. And I may be able to push back and say, what, that one's not going to work or maybe not. But ultimately, I'm going to have to figure out how to either implement this control or figure out how to provide mitigating controls that will resolve that vulnerability or that issue. And I may be evaluating specifically for functionality. So from the IT side, I don't want to affect my user negatively. I want to make sure that they are, they have all of their systems available and functional. And so my objectives and goals are going to be a little bit different than the security side of the house. Security, we're concerned with risk. I want to make sure that the system is secure. And of course, I want to work with the business. I want to make sure that what I'm telling IT aligns with the business and the strategy. But, ultimately, I still need my main primary objective is to secure the network, to secure the organization. So I'm going to select those controls based on maybe whatever requirements I may have. If I'm a federal organization versus a private sector organization, that may be different. And then ultimately monitoring for any inconsistencies. So my favorite example is sort of, I've applied a GPO for a setting. Well, what happens if I move? Maybe I have, 100 computers in that OU. What if I moved them from there to a different OU and I didn't take the GPOs with me to the new OU? Or maybe I didn't take all of them. It's possible that some of those settings would then end up being missing from those systems. So me as security, it's my job to make sure that those settings are being applied consistently and, as I expect them to. So, perception. When I started looking into sort of seeing the same problems that I see over and over again in security, and studying the idea of human factors. So human factors is really, it's sort of this blend of engineering, design, and psychology, really ultimately trying to make tools the best way that we can for humans to use them. And so that got me thinking, well, hold on a second. If I start to blend some of those psychological concepts or some of those really the terminology that we're using in psychology, if I start applying that in cybersecurity, can I start to address some of those gaps that I'm seeing? So perception, this is how we interpret a situation. And we're going to talk about some specific cases here because I think it's important to actually highlight how this works in the real world. But perception is, how do I understand a situation? How do I understand the world around me? This is sensory based, versus cognition. Cognition is really, how do we make decisions? And there may be some perception or some bias there based on our past experiences, but we are making decisions based on our understanding of a situation. I like to equate this to when I talk about cognition, I talk a lot about chess. Perception is more, I've interacted with an individual before. If I've had a negative interaction, how does that affect my perception of that individual? And it could solely be based on that one situation, that one interaction I had. But maybe that person was having a bad day. Maybe, they had a donut for breakfast and their donut dropped on the ground. Like, oh, that's frustrating. And so maybe I had a bad interaction with them because maybe they were frustrated that morning, not because they're a bad person. But my perception may change of that individual based on that interaction. But so for perception, it's handled in a couple of different ways. The way that we perceive and handle decision making using perception, bottom-up processing versus top-down processing. So, for example, if I stub my toe, I have pain that shoots through my toe, potentially up through my leg, and I'm like, oh my gosh, ow, that was my toe. That for me, that changes my perception of a situation. It's like, oh, wow, that was immediate and that hurt a lot. And it's a sensory thing. That was a pain sort of reaction. Versus if I'm sitting on the beach and, my hands go in the sand and I can feel the sand, and my perception of the beach and where I'm at changes based on what I feel and even what I see and what I smell. If you're at the ocean and you're smelling the ocean, you have memories that are based on those sensory sort of inputs that we have. So to dig a little bit deeper into perception versus cognition. So this is where I was starting to talk about chess. If I'm talking about cognition, I'm talking about how do I make decisions. If I'm playing chess and I'm playing a 2-minute chess match versus an hour-long chess match, I'm going to be playing that quite differently. 2 minutes is not a lot of time. That's 1 minute per player. That's 1 minute for me to process an entire chess game. So I'm going to be really playing that game based on my past experience with chess and the fastest thinking that I can do to make sure that I'm making those decisions to try to win the game. If I'm playing a 2-minute chess match, I may be okay with losing my queen very early on because it's like, hey, I got to keep moving. I can't focus too much on the implications of losing that queen. I need to figure out how do I handle that and overcome. Versus an hour-long chess match, I'm going to have time to really think about 30 moves ahead. If I move here, what will my opponent do? If I move here, what will my opponent do? If I move here, how many different ways could my opponent react to that, me moving that piece? So you're really thinking in multiple different ways and really deeply considering what implications moving a piece might have. Visual perception, there's a lot of really great research out there. And of course, I'm unfortunately not going to have time to talk a lot about it, but I highly suggest if you're interested in this topic and how it might relate to your cybersecurity teams, just on Google Scholar, look up visual perception because that primarily recently, they're talking about it as being, one of the primary ways that we make decisions is how we see something. So if I see someone, oop, I think I'm getting some echo. Okay, so if I see someone and I see their body language, that may change the way that I handle a decision or the way that I, sort of interact with someone. So the way that we visually see something, it may change the way that we handle decisions. And quickly, I want to touch on metacognition. This is one of the most interesting things I think I found when I was studying cognition and perception. This is the way that after we make a decision, we really think about how we made that decision. So if I'm making a risk-based decision, how did I come to that decision? Was it the right decision? Was it the wrong decision? And if it was, how could I change that the next time to make sure that I make a more appropriate decision? So I love the term meta because we use it for lots of different ways, metadata and all that. But for metacognition, you're really taking that step from, okay, I've made a decision to evaluating how that decision was made. And I think especially in cybersecurity, this is a really important concept because we're constantly, our jobs are really making decisions. Is this alert malicious or not? Is this network traffic malicious or not? So there's a lot of the ability to make decisions and make them quickly. But then we have to really go back and say, how did we make that decision? How did I determine that that was a malicious file versus non-malicious? How did I determine that that website should be blocked versus maybe not? So a couple examples here. I wanted to mention the sort of the fear-based response based on experience, which is more perception-based. So let's say, for example, I responded to an incident. There was an incident that happened, a security incident that happened. And I know if I don't do something, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble, or I might be held accountable for it. I'm scared of making the wrong decision. But so ultimately, I'm going to quickly move. I'm going to communicate probably really effectively, try to tell whoever I can tell ahead of time, so that way it doesn't get, out of hand quickly. Or if I'm too scared to tell somebody about something, that's when, issues really arise, right? It's like, if I see alerts coming in, but I'm really scared to tell my management about it because maybe in the past I've had an experience where they got really upset with me. What happens if, a SOC analyst who's nervous about telling their management about an incident, what happens if that incident goes unnoticed or like undisclosed for an hour versus 2 hours versus 3 hours? What happens? How does our risk, sort of go up at that point? So I think it's really important, especially when we're talking about perception, to talk about how fear-based responses could impact the overall security of our environment. And across different teams, right? Not just, a SOC analyst talking to a manager, but maybe even a manager talking to executive management. Maybe there's concern there that if an incident is happening, that there may be, repercussions, and that not addressing the situation, or not taking it up with the highest executives. Maybe that could end up being a much bigger incident than maybe it would have been if it was addressed immediately. So, senses and cybersecurity. When I was putting this presentation together, this concept really hit me. How do we use our senses to either make decisions, to understand a situation, to manage and monitor alerts, to configure our security tools? How do we, especially visually, and with the tools that we have, how do we interact during an incident, a security incident? What tools do we have available to us, and how do we see them? I'm really big on, having security tools. We have to have them, right? We need them. They help give us great information that we can then make objective decisions on. However, if we have too many security tools, it's very possible that, I could, if I've got 10 security tools that one analyst, need to manage, it's very difficult for me to make sure that I'm using all of those tools to the best of their ability, so that I can configure those tools properly. Because when you have 10 tools to manage, potentially upgrades, patching at the OS level, the application level, and maybe a device as well, you have to consider all of that time. Updates to the software, there may be new things that have to be configured. It's possible that over time that tool wasn't configured properly initially, and so it's not working well now, maybe a year later or 2 years later. So am I using the tools that I have properly? Am I able to visually see those tools and get effective information, helpful information? Which is where I want to talk about cognitive limitations. If I'm focused on, like my number 2 bullet here, if I'm focused on the data that I'm seeing in these tools, if I'm focused on all of the information that's coming out from, all the products, the patches, the security controls, the frameworks, the guidance, the policies, and what I'm being told by peers, colleagues, management, executives, strategic business direction, I think you can kind of see where I'm going, but this is where, we start talking about burnout, cognitive limitations. How much can I as an individual really handle? In cybersecurity, we have so many different things that we have to not only manage from a technical perspective, but we have to manage relationships with IT operations, with developers, with maybe product and product managers. Maybe from the SOC perspective, maybe I have to deal with customers or third-party vendors. So there are a lot of things that I, as a security professional, need to manage. And there's only so much that we can sort of handle and bring into it. And so we start to get this sort of sensory overload, this way too much information. So I think there's sort of this interesting conversation that has to happen on how much information are you digesting and ingesting from security tools, from products, from patching, from a remediation standpoint. How much can we handle and really digest, and then use that to make really good, clear decisions for risk-based decisions. And for the third item here that I wanted to talk about, can we interpret risk based on how security analysts perceive a situation? So if I, as a SOC analyst, with my years of experience and the ability to sort of pinpoint where an alert might be noise and where an alert might be malicious or anomalous, that's sort of based on my previous experiences and based on my education, based on my awareness of the system, then we can make risk-based decisions. And we use all of the tools at our disposal, including my perception of the situation. If I'm monitoring a network and I see something that doesn't look right to me, whether or not I can pinpoint it right away, whether it's an alert, a strange IP, something like that, but if I can start to pinpoint that, I'm using my perception, my experience to help make risk-based decisions. But we don't talk about it in that context necessarily. I think there's real power in using the right terminology, using the right, and then on top of that, using the right definitions for those terms. So for example, vulnerability management, which is probably my favorite topic besides human factors. But when we're talking about vulnerability management, if I asked individual 1 and individual 2 what their definitions of vulnerability management was, I would probably get 2 different answers. Some people see it as really, a patch management sort of activity. Some people see it more from the remediation standpoint. Some people see it as a continuous monitoring sort of exercise. So our perception of the terminology that we use can really impact the way that we think about security of a system. So I think there is real power in using terms like perception, the way that we sense things, the way that we use our intuition based on experience to help us manage risk. And then ultimately, how does our perception affect how we use those security tools, how we interact with other teams, whether that's IT operations or developers? And then ultimately, how do we respond to incidents based on that perception? So I'm going to talk about some cases, but I really wanted to sort of highlight this because this is really the reason why I think that sometimes I continue to see the same types of attacks over and over again. Attackers think about things in a very different way than us as network defenders do. And I think if we can start to integrate some of those psychological concepts and terms into our everyday security vocabulary, it may help us say like, oh, I didn't think about how my perception of a tool might have affected that security or risk-based decision. But now I'm thinking, oh, I perceive this tool differently based on my personal experience. How does my coworker perceive this tool? And have a discussion about that. Hey, what is your perception of this tool? How do you feel about this tool? Do you think that it's useful based on your experience and your perception? Because sometimes I know I can have the wrong perception of something based on my experience. And so really communicating, collaborating, talking with other people about how they feel about something or what they've experienced can help change my perception of something too. So that's sort of where we're going to talk about some of the actionable takeaways, but really just sort of having that idea of, okay, I need to think about how this situation, how this tool, how my interaction with this tool has changed the way that I feel about this. Okay, so perception over time. This is this is what I think is also another really important conversation to have. I know I can just speak on my own experience. My perception has really changed over time, especially for risk-based decisions. When I was in IT operations and I started studying vulnerability scoring, how low and medium vulnerabilities could be exploited, that really changed my entire perception and my perspective about what security meant to me as a system owner. So over time, being a system admin on day one, I didn't have any biases. I didn't have any fear or concern. It was just, hey, I'm here to learn and I'm here to manage an environment. Versus maybe my second week on the job where I've met a number of team members. I've probably gone through initial training and learned more about the organization, meeting even other teams that I might be working with. So first impressions are really important. So the way that I've had first interactions with people, that could change my perception almost immediately of how I feel like I might interact with people. Versus 6 months down the road, I've probably been working on some projects, working with other teams, really getting a better understanding of the infrastructure and the technology at play. What does the tech stack look like? I think one of my prior colleagues, it was because I was feeling like I was a little lost, especially in the first 6 months. I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm still learning so much. And he said to me, he was like, listen, it takes 6 months to a year to really learn a network. Like it can really take a long time, especially in really highly complex environments. So he was like, don't worry about it. It's going to take some time. It's fine. So anyway, but by 6 months, you're starting to really get a better understanding technically of what's going on across the organization. Then let's say 4 years down the road, bias starts to come in. Maybe you've had bad interactions with, other coworkers. Maybe you've had frustrating sort of projects or projects that failed for whatever reason. That affects the perception, the way that you perceive the environment, maybe the way you perceive coworkers, maybe the way you perceive tools and vendor relationships. So biases really start to, especially as someone who continues to grow within an environment, biases really start to come in based on those experiences. And then 10 years, I asked the question, like, what might be the issue here? But after 10 years, especially, within one organization or working in sort of one sort of environment, you really would have a lot of bias based on past experience. And that's totally acceptable, right? If we experienced a bad relationship with someone over 10 years, my perception is that that's not going to change. That relationship's probably not going to change. But so after, a certain amount of time, it's different for everyone, but perception is going to change. There may be negative perception when it comes to people, processes, or tools, as well as positive perception for people, process, tools. But what does that mean to my risk? So if my perception at the beginning of, a project or working with a team is positive, but it's really negative at the end of the project, how does that affect my risk? Does it? I mean, maybe it doesn't, but it's very possible that by the end, if you have a negative interaction with someone, or maybe the project just didn't go as planned, maybe, deadlines were missed, the project got pushed back, maybe the technology just ultimately wasn't going to work for the project or for the goals, but that can really potentially increase risk. I'll give a really specific example. So let's say you're evaluating a tool and it goes from, you have it in test and it works okay. And then, whoever decides, yep, put it into production. Well, you've got a test system now that maybe ended up into production. I know this is probably like wildly hypothetical, right? So you've got an environment now that's probably called something test that's now in production. Was it meant to go into production? What is the risk of putting that test item into production? Were all the security controls in place from the beginning? Were they tried to, did someone try to add them at the end? And were there maybe issues with that? So how does the perception of that tool over time change based on, maybe it moved from test to prod, maybe, you started having executives or management or, VIPs start to use this product, but you can't maybe necessarily guarantee that it's secure based on, sort of the inevitable push from test to prod. So it's just sort of something to consider if you think about how perception changes over time and how our interactions with technology change over time. It could potentially affect the risk of the organization. All right, so round one. I wanted to break down 3 different cases, mostly because, like I said, these are totally hypothetical, right? I'm sure these have never happened to anyone. But I think it's important to talk about how perception might actually, in the real world, practically affect either relationships or overall risk. So let's say there's an IT ops group. They're working on upgrading OS levels. Let's just say Windows 10 to Windows 11, something like that, or Windows 7 to Windows 10, probably years ago. So maybe the security team, because of maybe EOL, maybe there's vulnerabilities and risk, they are pushing for, a specific timeline because it's like, hey, there's critical vulnerabilities. This is end of life. We've got to get this out the door. It's got to go. But then tension builds between teams because maybe the IT operations team, maybe they're getting different direction from IT management versus what they're getting from the security team. So they're sort of maybe caught in the middle trying to figure out how do we balance functionality for our user versus security and making sure that we are, upgrading those systems as quickly as possible, but without affecting functionality for, my users. Both teams go to the management, there's contention, there's issues. So not just how do we solve this, but how does this affect risk? So if I'm thinking about risk here, it's possible that these systems may not get upgraded because, their IT operations or not get updated, as quickly as maybe security would like, because there's a functionality issue. There's a concern over customer. Maybe there's a concern over revenue even that, hey, if I don't fix this fast enough, or if I fix this too quickly, I might affect the actual revenue for the business if I affect our customers. So there's a lot of concern there and a lot of, perception that's going to change after this interaction. This is one upgrade for an operating system. This isn't an application or hardware upgrades or anything like that. And if the timeline gets pushed, the risk increases. If the teams have trouble working together or they have a bad interaction where they're sort of talking about these things, IT operations may be very hesitant to work with security in the future. If they're concerned that, oh my gosh, if I do this upgrade, it's going to break everything, or, I can't affect my users and my customers because that's my number one goal and objective. So I think as far as solving this is it's really, we talk a lot about shift left and improving security sort of, I think, from the beginning, from the onset. And that's certainly a great goal. And I think what a lot of people are moving towards. But I think it's almost a little bit deeper than that as far as communication goes. I think security, it's there to enable the business and it's there to, sort of work with people. And I think in the past, there's been this sort of negative perception of, security is just here to bang on my door and make me implement these 300 controls and not give me any information. But there are a lot of, security engineers, ISOs, that want to really help enable the business and improve security without affecting functionality and meeting that business strategy. So I think that, it maybe in this particular situation, there was a negative perception of how security might affect the functionality for the users. But, maybe it's just perception. Maybe that's not actually what they were intending to do. But intention doesn't always meet perception. All right, round 2. So Security versus executive management. Again, totally hypothetical. I'm sure this has never happened. So security is working on a critical vulnerability. They have expressed urgency to the CIO, making sure that this gets done very quickly and immediately. But the CIO, thinking about the business, thinking about customers and users. Hey, I can't do this during production hours. This is not going to happen. We need to figure out like a better way to do this, and I'm not going to affect this. And let's say that they're at the end of a quarter and they say, you know what, I'm at the end of a quarter. I can't do this right now because this is going to affect sales or productivity, whatever it might be. And you know what, I don't have enough information. So we're not going to do this right now. If this is a critical, not just critical, but exploitable vulnerability, what would have maybe been a better way for security to address this to management? Maybe instead of saying there's a critical vulnerability, we have to do this right now. What could be a better way to do this would be laying out a plan, because that perception then is, executive management, that CIO may be like, you know what, I don't trust them. They're just telling me to do this and they don't understand what we've got going on here. So maybe from the security side of the house, I could have gone to the CIO and said, this is a highly exploitable vulnerability. We know these APT groups are using this actively right now in campaigns against businesses just like us. And if the system, if we get affected by this, if we are, hit by this APT group, we will lose X amount of dollars. We will lose this much, downtime, and the time for the downtime during production hours to get this resolved versus the possible impact for company reputation, lost revenue, all of those things. That might be a better way to show the understanding of the business, to show that security understands the needs while also expressing that, you know what, this is a serious impact to our entire organization, not just, yes, we have thousands of vulnerabilities, but this one in particular could ruin our business. So it sort of, changes the way the conversation happens. And it also improves probably the perception of how management feels about security overall. It's like, oh, hey, they were thinking about all this stuff. They gave me all this great information, and now I can make a better risk-based decision based on this, instead of sort of maybe having, a negative perception, or maybe there was a negative interaction in the past that affected their perception and they were just like, you know what, I'm not going to put up with this. So it is possible that perception of the security team or of the information given to them was negative, whether, appropriate or not. But that perception might change that conversation. And so if there is already a negative perception in place for security controls or vulnerabilities or whatever it might be that need to be resolved, it starts with changing that perception and not saying, not doing the same thing over and over again and saying like, why don't they listen to me? But changing that conversation might change that perception, might help reduce risk. All right, round 3. So here I wanted to talk about just a little bit different angle, third-party vendor versus the security engineer. So a security engineer, they need more information from this third-party vendor. Hey, I need to understand your product better. I need to understand what's going on. And, this third party is like, yeah, but here's my documentation. Everything's fine. I have this all documented. It's here. This is all that you need. So that may change the perception that the security engineer has of that vendor if they feel like they're not getting enough information, enough documentation, or that they're sort of what they need is not being heard. That may change the perception of how the security engineer works with that tool or works with that vendor, and they may not use that anymore. So there's this sort of possibility that, with a negative interaction like this may change the perception of how they use these products, which again may also affect the security, although potentially in a positive way. If I have a negative perception of a vendor and I may not use their product anymore, that whether good or bad, that's sort of my perception, right? So even a year from then, if that third party vendor or a vendor comes back and says, hey, we'd like for you to try our product, I may already have a pretty cemented perception of how I feel about that company or organization. Even if, let's say, they have new products or they've improved their security of their products and they can provide more information, I may still have that perception, that sort of negative interaction that I'm like, you know what? I'm just not going to use them because I didn't get a good feeling the first time. Now, that could be, like I said, it could actually potentially be a good thing. It might help improve security of that environment if you don't sort of trust that organization or you're not quite sure if you should or not, then maybe that's probably a good way to go. However, it is possible that, a specific tool or a specific a third-party application, something like that, it is possible that it might be necessary for a business functionality or something like that. So it is possible that it may have to be integrated at some point, just depending on what's available on the market. I mean, fortunately, there are a lot of vendors out there, but if the business is looking for something in particular, they may say, you know what, we're going to go ahead with this product anyway, even if we're not getting the information we want because we have to, because it's a business need. So that may change the way the security engineer feels about that product or that company or whatever it might be. But it may still be a sort of a necessary tool that has to be used in the organization. But the point is that the perception of the security engineer is probably going to change. And even if that's going to change towards management, if they say, well, you know what, we have to use this tool anyway, so just sort of deal with it. We have to deal with it. The security engineer might change the way that they feel about management too. It's like, they don't understand what I'm, trying to express or trying to explain, which can change the way that they maybe interact with management in the future. Maybe they're not going to tell them in the future, like, well, they didn't listen to me the first time, I'm not going to tell them the second or third time, when this happens, which again, if there are unremediated vulnerabilities or, other issues with the product, and the security engineer doesn't feel comfortable going to management and saying anything again because they feel like maybe they're not being heard, that would severely increase risk across the environment if they are not actually expressing that to management. So, actionable takeaways. I know I covered a lot, but hopefully I sort of brought the story together. The biggest things here, I would say, really understanding the concepts of perception and cognition, so how we make decisions, and then like, how do I make decisions? How do I make risk-based decisions in my organization? And how does perception affect those risk-based decisions? How does my interaction with other teams affect how I associate risk with software, with products? How do I use my security tools? How do I perceive my security tools? And how it's really affecting the overall security strategy. So not just how does it affect security today, but just like I was talking about perception over time, how has maybe a negative perception between teams or negative interactions between teams affected the security strategy over time? So considering not just today how it might be impactful, but in 5 years, how will perception change, or how could I change the perception of maybe the security team or tools or products to make sure that I am improving security in the future as an organization grows. How does psychology fit into RMF? So I love the risk management framework. I think it's a fantastic place for organizations to really start to build sort of a risk management strategy, right? But I'm curious if there would maybe there is something missing there that we're not talking about, the actual interactions with teams. It's very laid out very well who sort of owns and manages each step in the RMF process. But what if there was sort of an interaction component or a perception component in RMF that helps to identify where, psychology and behaviors, behavioral analysis or behaviors of people affect the way that we implement and manage RMF, like in an organization? And do you have people trained in human factors on your security teams? If not, why not? There are a lot of great cognitive psychologists that I'm aware of that are sort of moving into security, whether that's through teaching or into industry. And it's very, very helpful. I think it's really helpful because it helps to look at security in a different way. If we keep trying to solve problems in the same ways, it's just, I can't remember who said it, but it's like that leads to madness, just continuing to sort of try to solve problems the same way, and we're not getting anywhere. So, so think about how human factors in engineering, think about how psychology might affect your organization. Maybe it'll be helpful to understand those terms and that terminology. Wrapping up, so just final sort of thoughts here. You know, we as humans are the ones that are using these products. We're using the technology, we're using the software, and we're working with IT development, product, strategy, marketing, all of that stuff. We're working with them. So how are we using this as humans? How does perception, again, affect the overall security strategy? Humans and our interactions with other humans can really play a major part into how we implement, monitor, and manage security controls. And consider what security controls might be in your environment that are not just technical. What security controls are people focused or people centric? And then just sort of evaluate, you know, taking stock, and I try to do this too. If I interact with someone, how did they potentially perceive that situation? Did they have a positive perception? Did we have a positive interaction? Will that positively impact the security posture of my organization? So sort of taking that back and thinking about how perception, and even, you know, for me, what biases do I have that are impacting me implementing security? So that's going to wrap up my presentation. I hope it was helpful, and I hope that I gave some actionable items for you guys to take back. I think I'll be hanging out in Discord for a while. There's my LinkedIn if you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I just wanted to say a final big thank you to BSides Delaware for having me today. And there's a ton of great talks. I know I'm excited about them, but I'll go ahead and stop sharing and turn it back over.